You probably believed her too. The voice, the turtleneck, the story about needles. So did Henry Kissinger. So did George Shultz. So did Rupert Murdoch. So did the people who run America. And while they were believing her, a woman named Rochelle was being told she had cancer. She didn't. Rochelle was 53 years old. She walked into a Walgreens on a Tuesday afternoon. Finger prick. Quiet wait. 3 days. When the results came, the numbers were alarming. Her doctor reviewed them. She started treatment. She told her family. She rearranged her life. That night, Rochelle sat at her kitchen table staring at the paper. Nothing made sense. Months later, she found out the truth. The machine that produced those numbers had never worked. Rochelle wasn't alone. There were thousands like her. This is the story of how the most powerful people in America were all wrong about the same woman at the same time, and how a 23-year-old kid was the only one who said it out loud. A drop of blood. That was the pitch. No vials, no needles, no clinic, just a fingertip. From one drop, hundreds of tests, a device the size of a toaster, complete medical diagnostics, anywhere, anytime, for anyone. It became a company worth $9 billion. $9 billion. For a machine that barely existed. Stop and think about that. $9 billion. Bigger than most public companies. Built on a machine no independent scientist had ever verified. Here's the question almost no one asked. How does a single drop replace 50 years of medical infrastructure? It can't. A pregnancy test needs urine. A cholesterol test needs serum. An HIV test needs whole blood. These aren't preferences, they're chemistry. One machine cannot do all of them from one drop. That was the science. But Theranos wasn't selling science, it was selling certainty. And certainty is easier to believe in than complexity. Now, meet the founder. Elizabeth Holmes was 19 years old when she dropped out of Stanford. She had 1 semester of chemical engineering. She had never built a medical device. She had never run a company. She had never published a paper in a scientific journal. What she had was a story. Her uncle had died of cancer. She wanted to make sure no one else had to wait for results the way her family had. It was a good story. It was also rehearsed. Holmes started wearing black turtlenecks every single day. She lowered her voice an octave when she spoke in public. She unblinkingly held eye contact in interviews, a technique she practiced. She did not invent these things, she borrowed them. From Steve Jobs, the turtleneck, the intensity, the dropping out of Stanford origin myth. She was not building a company, she was performing one. And here is the part Silicon Valley still hasn't reckoned with. The performance worked. Then the money started moving. Rupert Murdoch wrote a check, $125 million. The DeVos family, over 100 million. The Waltons, the Coxes. None of them tested the technology. None of them needed to. Once enough powerful people believed the story, doubt became socially expensive. By 2014, the company was worth $9 billion. It had never produced a reliable machine. Almost no one was asking why. The board of directors included Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, 2 former U.S. Secretaries of State, a former defense secretary, 2 senators. None of them were scientists. None of them tested the technology either. People assumed they had checked. They hadn't. They were credibility, not verification. This is how a castle gets built on air, not through one giant lie, through thousands of smaller assumptions. Rochelle trusted Walgreens. Walgreens trusted Theranos. Theranos had the names already attached. Every link in that chain assumed someone else had checked. No one had. Inside Theranos, the technology didn't work. Not in development, not in testing, not when patients were already using it. The machines were called Edison, named after the famous inventor. The Edison machines could only run 12 of the 240 tests Theranos was advertising. 12 out of 240. For the rest, the company secretly switched. When patients walked into a Walgreens expecting Theranos technology, their blood was being run on the same commercial analyzers Theranos had publicly claimed to replace. The revolutionary device was a prop. The actual work was being done by the system Theranos had built its identity on destroying. Engineers knew. Scientists knew. Lab directors knew. In 2014, a young scientist named Tyler Schultz stood in the Theranos lab. He watched a Theranos device produce a blood test result. Then he watched another employee silently take the same blood sample, walk it into a different room, and run it through a Siemens analyzer. 2 minutes later, a different number came out. Tyler didn't say anything. He went home that night and couldn't sleep. His grandfather was on the Theranos board. His grandfather was George Shultz, former Secretary of State, the man who told Tyler that Elizabeth Holmes was the future of medicine. Tyler was 23 years old. He sent his grandfather a letter raising concerns. His grandfather sent it back to Theranos. The company sent lawyers. Tyler's family spent over $400,000 defending him from threats and surveillance. His grandfather, until almost the end of his life, refused to believe him. This is the part most people miss. Tyler wasn't fighting Holmes. Tyler was fighting his own family, his own grandfather, the Secretary of State. He was 23, and he was the only one who said the truth out loud. October 2015. A Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou publishes an investigation. Tyler Schultz is one of his primary sources. The story names what the inside knew. Manipulated data, staged demonstrations, faulty devices delivering unreliable results to real patients. Within weeks, the dominoes fall. Federal regulators move in. Investigators open probes. Walgreens shuts down testing in every store. Partners pull contracts. $9 billion. Gone. In less than 2 years. Rochelle was one of those patients. 6 months on a treatment she didn't need. 6 months of fear. 6 months of side effects. 6 months she would never get back. She was one of thousands. Theranos didn't know how many. At some point, they stopped counting. In 2018, Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. The trial took years. The jury heard from former employees, from scientists, from patients, from investors who lost everything. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison. Sunny Balwani received nearly 13 years. Holmes reported to prison in 2023. She gave birth to her second child shortly before her sentence began. The black turtleneck was gone. The Steve Jobs cosplay was gone. The deep voice, the one she had reportedly practiced, was gone. In its place was a woman in beige khakis walking into a federal facility. The empire she built was over. But here is what most people get wrong about the ending. Theranos didn't fall because Elizabeth Holmes was finally exposed. Theranos fell because the truth became impossible to contain. The technology never worked. It was never going to work. For 15 years, the only thing holding it together was belief. And here is the part of this story that should bother you most. Elizabeth Holmes did not deceive people who were paying attention. She succeeded with people who had every reason to verify her, and chose not to. The investors weren't fools. They were running on social proof. Once Henry Kissinger was in, doubt looked like ignorance. Once Rupert Murdoch wrote a check, due diligence felt unnecessary. Once George Shultz was on the board, the rest of the world stopped asking questions. Theranos didn't fail because Elizabeth Holmes was a liar. It failed because everyone needed her to be telling the truth. The board needed her to be the female Steve Jobs. The investors needed her to be the next breakthrough. The media needed her to be a story. And the people who run Silicon Valley needed her to prove that they still knew genius when they saw it. So they stopped looking. They stopped checking. They stopped asking the only question that mattered. Is it true? Not. Is it impressive? Not. Is the founder convincing? Not. Who else invested? Just, is it true? The next Theranos is already being built. Probably in healthcare. Probably in artificial intelligence. Probably with a founder you have already heard of. And the only thing standing between you and the next one is the question almost no one asked the first time. Trust, once lost, cannot be invented. Science is not storytelling, and reality does not care how badly people want to believe. Rochelle eventually rebuilt her life. New doctors, real tests, real decisions. But she never forgot that Tuesday. The finger prick, the quiet wait, the paper sitting on the kitchen table. The moment she realized that someone had looked at her health, at her life, and decided that the story was more important than the truth. Rochelle still has the paper. The original test result. She keeps it in a drawer in her kitchen. She says it reminds her not to trust anyone who sounds too certain. She is not in a courtroom. She is not in a headline. She is not in any of the books written about Theranos. She is just one of thousands. And that is why this story matters. Because Elizabeth Holmes is in prison. The system that made her is not. The next one is already being built. Her name was Rochelle. She was 53 years old, and she deserved better than a story.